I grew up in a small village out in the countryside, and when I was a teenager, there wasn't a lot to do. Neither were there many places for us to go after school. We used to hang around at the local park, but after a couple of incidents, nothing to do with me or the people I hung around with, they started closing the park at night, and the police would check the place pretty regularly. I guess they had nothing better to do. Because of this, me and my mates started hanging around in the local cemetery in the evenings and after dark. I know that sounds super disrespectful, but the grounds were really big, and at the far end they had a couple of benches under a tree that weren't close to any graves or anything like that. They never locked the cemetery gates, so we used to hang out on these benches and just chill. We'd smoke and drink a little bit, but nothing crazy, and we'd always take out what we brought in. For teenagers, we were pretty respectful. Well, one summer we had been hanging out, but it started raining, so we packed up to leave. Most of my friends left via the front gate to get home, but I was staying at my friend Mike's house, and we could cut through a side gate for his. We hadn't brought any torches or anything, and this was before camera phones with a flash on them. The last couple of nights, we hadn't needed any. Even though it had been nighttime, the stars and moon were out, and there had been enough light to see the path until we made it to the road. Well, this night, with the rain, there obviously wasn't any stars visible. It was really quite dark. Mike was joking about it, pretending to get lost from the path and getting pretend frightened at things that weren't there. The whole spooky graveyard thing. He was a bit of a clown, so I was used to it. I carried on walking. Mike was behind me, goofing around, when suddenly I heard him yell, and then a thud, a fall, and then there was no sound. I turned around and Mike was gone. It was dark, obviously, but I had been able to make out his shape as we walked. I called Mike's name, not loudly. I was pretty spooked, but I was trying to appear calm, as I thought it might be another of his pranks. There was no response. I called his name again, and then came this blood-chilling scream. But it came from the ground, like beneath me. I didn't understand. It was coming from down and to my left. Then Mike started saying, "Get me out, get me out." And that's when it dawned on me that he must be in a hole, a grave. I started walking forward towards Mike's voice, but also I didn't want to fall into anything myself. Finally, I found the edge of the hole and called Mike's name. That freaked him out even more for a second. Then he took my hand and I pulled him out of there. I asked him what happened, what was wrong. He was completely freaked out. I'd never seen anyone who seemed so unsettled. He wouldn't tell me, though. He just started shuffling toward the gate and telling me we had to get out of here. Well, when we got back to his house and he finally started to calm down, he told me what happened. He had fallen into a grave, but not like one that had been dug ready for someone. A used grave, an old grave. He had fallen into a grave and he could feel bones like a skeleton in there with him. The next morning we told his parents and they came with us to check it out. There was a grave that had been dug up and there was a skeleton, or parts of it, remains at the bottom. His parents contacted the authorities and the local newspaper picked it up as well. We never found out who or why the grave was dug up, but the story in the papers was that it was of some old rich person who was believed to have been buried with a bunch of stuff. So, grave robbers, I guess. After that, a friend's parent let us smoke and hang out in their garage, so no more cemetery. I live opposite an old cemetery. It's still in use, like you can be buried there, but the original cemetery goes back to the 1700s. It's got this big ornate cast iron gate at the front and then stone walls and iron railings all around the edge. My house kind of faces the gate. It can be a pretty eerie place, particularly at night. One autumn I was working from home a lot and my home office window faces the cemetery. There was this crow that used to always sit on the entrance gate. I later found out it was actually a raven. Sometimes I'd look up and I swear this bird was watching me, just sat on top of this big gate staring at me. It wasn't sat on the gate all the time, but sometimes I would be working and I'd get that feeling of being watched. I'd look up and the crow, the raven, would be back staring at me. I know it sounds silly, but it started to kind of freak me out. Then one time I was working on a report and I happened to look up and I completely freaked out. I literally jumped out of my chair. The raven was at my window, sat on the ledge outside, one eye just looking at me. I had never been so close to one before, and it was really big. I was so unsettled I had to go get my husband. He laughed and came in to see, but it had gone when we went back in the room. Well, after a few weeks, I sort of got used to this bird. It still unsettled me, but it was only a bird at the end of the day. Then I started to notice the neighbor's cat getting really curious about it. Most times when the cat started climbing the wall next to the gate, the bird would look at it and then fly away. One time, though, the raven went for the cat and the cat got scared and ran and the raven chased it. I actually mentioned it to my neighbor in a half-joking kind of way that he should keep an eye on his cat, but he told me how he hates the bird, always crowing in the morning and waking him up, which I thought was strange because I had never heard him make a sound. One evening around sunset, I looked up from my laptop and saw the cat leaping at the raven. It killed it. There were feathers everywhere. I felt kind of sad even though it had freaked me out so much. But a week later, my husband was going to work when he saw the cat out in his neighbor's lawn. It had had its guts and eyes ripped out. We never knew what did it, and the cat definitely killed that raven. I saw it happen. But ever since then, I've always felt it had something to do with that raven and the cemetery it was guarding. My mother passed away a few years ago. I didn't have a big family and we were very close. I stayed in the same town I grew up in, and so she was buried at one of the local cemeteries, which is very close to where I live. At the end of most weeks, I visit her grave and bring her fresh flowers and stay for a bit and just kind of hang out with her, if that makes sense. Well, I've been doing this for about 6 months. It really helped bring me some healing. The more I visited, the more I got to recognize those people who would also regularly visit a loved one like me. They were mainly old men and women. After a few months, a new face started to show up. I noticed him because although he was older than me, he was still only in his 40s, probably a lot younger than the other folks. He seemed to have a loved one buried quite near my mum. One day, I struck up a conversation with him. I was just trying to be nice. Grief can be tough. That's when he told me he didn't have anyone buried here. He just liked hanging out here, which I thought was a bit strange, especially given the fact that he always ended up sitting on a bench really near me. After that, he kept trying to talk to me every time I went. I tried to make it clear I didn't really want a conversation, but he was persistent. I even tried going on different days at different times, but he would always just show up, which, looking back, was really strange. Once a coincidence, but almost every time, no. But I guess I wasn't really thinking clearly. grief brain or something like that. And then one day I saw him on the street where I lived. Now I was starting to get pretty freaked out. I told my boyfriend about it, but by the time he got outside, the man had gone. Not long after that, my boyfriend was out with some friends and I had stayed home. I hadn't been to visit my mum in a little while because I was too worried about bumping into that guy again. Well, that night there was a knock on the door, and it was him, the man from the cemetery. He kept knocking and knocking and knocking. I didn't answer the door. I pretended not to be in, but he seemed to know I was there. He just kept knocking. I rang my boyfriend and the police. The police arrived first, which was lucky because my boyfriend was really worked up. It transpired that this man was known to the police and had convictions for assaults against women. We got a restraining order put on him, and after the police talked to him, we haven't seen him since, thankfully. Still, I always visit my mum's grave at different times now. It just doesn't feel the same, though.